everybody. I'm Hillary Atkin from the Atkin Report in Los Angeles, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Scott Huver, the author of Beverly Hills Noir, to this edition of Hillary's Happy Hour. Scott, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, Hillary.
You're welcome. The subtitle of your book, published by Simon and Schuster and just out on audiobook, is Crime, Sin, and Scandal in the 90210. I know you as an entertainment reporter, Scott, but early in your career, you covered crime for a Beverly Hills newspaper. So tell me about this trajectory.
Yeah, I literally, my very first job in Los Angeles was working at the Beverly Hills Courier, the longest running then and now newspaper in Beverly Hills. It was a job to pay bills. I had been, starting out as a journalist and freelancing in my home state of Michigan. But when I got here, that was the first job I responded to and the first job I got. And it opened up a very unusual world, as you can imagine. Like Beverly Hills was still kind of at the cusp of having that small town of the celebrities vibe. It's changed significantly in the 30 years since I started working there. But it still had the last little bit of that where you could walk along, the shopping streets, Rodeo Drive, Beverly, and see Jack Lemmon or Tony Curtis or, Suzanne Summers shopping or, hanging out, doing whatever. It's a little bit more touristy. That transition was happening, but it still is where so many people, not just Hollywood celebrities, but, corporate titans and CEOs and, various political dignitaries. Like it's a very interesting tiny little town.
Well, there's such an intersection between celebrity and crime that I'm sure you were right in the middle of. But how did these experiences that you had early on lead you to be fascinated by crime in Beverly Hills and then inspire you to write your first book?
Yeah. Quite literally, in the first week or so that I lived in Los Angeles, I lived about a block from the 405 freeway and saw the O.J. Simpson Bronco chase from my apartment window. And crime and celebrity became all consuming in Los Angeles through Beverly Hills. I mean, there were so many connections. Heidi Fleiss had happened in the early 90s. The Menendez trial was still underway. And then OJ just, sucked all the air out of the room for years in LA. So that was part of it. And then crime itself was at a higher rate back then. And Beverly Hills was a pretty rich target there was like, when I started, there was a big string of like follow home Rolex robberies. Somebody'd wear their nice, super expensive Rolex out to a party, get followed home and mugged, and there goes how many $1,000s. And Brink's armored car robberies were really big for some reason at the time. So there's definitely a higher crime rate, and it was a really really interesting place for me to get. I'd always just written about entertainment, but this was a full-time, like I did not just crime but city council, school board, real estate, commercial stuff, Rodeo Drive, all of it. But the crime was my favorite. And I got such an interesting window into the operations of the Beverly Hills Police Department, which is then and now as state of the art as you can get when it comes to your crime fighting tools, because they have such a great, taxpayer base and such a great support from the community who wants to feel protected. So it was fascinating. And then you throw celebrity into the mix. And as I dug into the history books, getting more and more familiar with the story of Beverly Hills, I just kept learning about all these different crimes that were, even if they didn't have a celebrity in them, they touched celebrities in one way or another. And they were just completely over the top and outrageous.
Yeah, Scott, one of the themes that I got from your book is if it wasn't about celebrity, it was about wealth. And one of the chapters delves into a legendary crime in Beverly Hills that happened at the Greystone Mansion, which I'm sure you've been to many times, as many of us Angelinos have, the murder of oil tycoon Ned Doheny from one of the richest families in Los Angeles by a family employee who was also found dead of a gunshot wound. So how were you captivated by this nearly century old double murder case.
It's interesting, the Doheny name is one of the foundations that all of Los Angeles is built on. And Greystone Mansion was built by Edward Doheny for his son Ned and Ned's family as an expression of his wealth. It was almost like the Southern California version of San Simeon. And the home was opened in 1928, and the family had resided there only for a few months before this like really horrible incident occurred. And it's part of local legend. It has been now since 1929, when this murder suicide occurred. What caught me was that it's still so mysterious as to what actually happened. And to kind of boil it down, Ned Doheny was the head of the manor, and he had his closest friend was also his personal secretary, a guy named Hugh Plunkett. They had been together for many years and seemed to be as close as brothers. And some people even would suggest that they were maybe closer than that. Okay. And these two men were found dead on the floor of one of the rooms in the mansion, both shot to death. And the official story seemed to support that it was, Ned had been confronted by Hugh, who was in some kind of frenzy, and shot, and then Hugh turned the gun on himself. But as I dug into it, and you look at reports that came out of that time, the evidence suggests that it's completely the opposite, and that it was Hugh that was murdered and Ned that killed himself. The forensics point in that direction completely, but it seems to be very much a Chinatown sort of situation where money and power wrote the final narrative. What's interesting about it is that both of these men were involved in something called the Teapot Dome scandal, which was akin to Watergate back in the day. It was a swap for oil rights to federal lands, and the Doheny family was embroiled in controversy and court cases that dragged out. And Ned and Hugh were the guys who delivered the money to the Secretary of the Interior for these oil rights that were in dispute. And the family was looking at some, real tough questioning on the stand. And Hugh was afraid he was going to get dragged into it. And that seemed to trigger this sort of mental collapse that was going on with him. He also had really significant health problems that was being treated with things you would not treat people with, akin to cocaine, all kinds of narcotics that are illegal now. So that may have contributed to the friction as well. So ultimately, it remains a mystery. Nobody really has ever come forward to say, I know what happened. It was kind of buried in the press. The DA kind of said he would fight it, didn't fight it. It's just lingered. And of course, the rumors that these two may have actually been romantically involved, something that I was never able to definitively say yes or no to as I researched it, adds this extra air of mystique and, what the heck happened that night in 1929.
Okay, well, you did a great job of digging into it, but I want to turn to another crime that has nothing to do with violence, but celebrity. And it's one incident became huge news because it involved young Hollywood starlet stealing so much merchandise from Saks Fifth Avenue. And that was Winona Ryder, who, of course, has since rehabilitated her career. She's now starring in Beetlejuice. But talk to me about the shock of a young starlet shoplifting.
It was so surprising. And, this is one, unlike a story from 1929, this is one that I lived through and actually covered the court case. And Winona Ryder was, from the outside looking in, at the top of the world. She was a huge box office draw. She was twice Oscar nominated. She was gorgeous. She was a fashion icon. Like, everything seemed to be lined up in her favor. And then all of a sudden, one day, here she is being arrested in Saks Fifth Avenue in Beverly Hills for shoplifting, when she spent almost an equivalent amount of money actually purchasing things while she was quietly stealing things on top of it. Things she could have afforded. They were designer items, yes, thousands of dollars worth, but she could have easily afforded it. So it was so perplexing, and even more so that she chose to fight the charges. She offered up a couple explanations that didn't quite hold water. She said that her personal assistant, she expected to have paid for it, or she expected to be billed later, or most interestingly, that she was trying out for a film role where she would be playing a shoplifter, and the director had instructed her to try to do it in real life to get a sense of what her character was going through. All of that was pretty flimsy. You would have thought she would have taken a plea deal. The DA's office was really interested in the wake of O.J. Simpson and other cases to convict a celebrity. So she kind of played into their hands. And really, what was going on was Winona was going through a very difficult emotional phase in her life where she was having huge imposter syndrome about all the success she was having. She was from a very counterculture kind of family, so it was an odd thing to be at the, glamorized and at the center of fame. And after she'd injured her elbow shooting a movie, she was also becoming very dependent on drugs to the point that she was doctor shopping and getting more, she had prescriptions, but more drugs than she should have been being given. And all of that served to cloud her judgment in such a way that this is where she ended up. Had she just kind of negotiated her way out of it, it wouldn't have become a thing, but it dragged out for a year in the courts. And she played a very, very smart PR game for a while where she leaned into the controversy. She hosted Saturday Night Live. She appeared on the cover of W Magazine wearing a Free Winona shirt, which had become very trendy in LA, and was very coy about it all until it got into court and the more sordid elements of her story started to come to light. And she was ultimately convicted. Hollywood would have worked with her again in a second, but they couldn't because they couldn't insure her for fear that she would, do something like this again and go back to jail. So it took her quite a while, but she needed that time to get her head back together. And remarkably, she became, an even bigger icon in fashion than she had been. She made a deal with Marc Jacobs, which was the very merchandise she stole from Saks Fifth Avenue.
Well, it's like Alanis Morissette says, isn't that ironic?
Yeah.
But Scott, you are a reporter by trade. So tell me about the research process that you conducted for the book. And I also hear that you have kept an archive of headline making stories over the decades.
Yeah, this all, I made my own morgue when I was at the newspaper, and kept my files and took those with me when I left. And there were certain stories that I had either worked on myself or had become fascinated with that over time was just sort of like when I'd have free time, it became like a hobby. I'd go down to the LA Public Library and sit in the microfiche machine and look up, more info on some of these stories. And I've got, 50, 60 stories that would be great to fit into books, And so over the years, I just kept accumulating, or I meet somebody here, talk to somebody there. And then the pandemic gave me the freedom to literally sit at home and be on, newspapers.com and go through those archives because now so much is available right online at the tip of your fingertips, and then reconnect with some of the police that I worked with and get their stories and get some more information about these things that were, never made public until now. Connect with some family members of some of the people who were featured in the story and just really do these sort of deep dives into the 8 different stories that I chose for this version, but I've got, a whole backlog of stuff that I can't wait to get into.
Well, it sounds like you have gathered more than enough material for your next book, Scott. So do you want to give us a hint of some of the other crimes that you would consider writing about?
Yeah, well, I'll give you a tease because I've just finished a story yesterday for the Hollywood Reporter that we'll be running in the Oscar issue in a week or so. It's a story that takes place on Oscar night in 1995, the year that Pulp Fiction was up for Best Picture and lost to Forrest Gump. And Harvey Weinstein threw a very big party at the very legendary Chasen's restaurant right at the border of Beverly Hills. And I reported on this then. I hadn't even lived in Los Angeles for a year. During the party, in which many other bizarre things happened that I tell in the story, a mugger robbed somebody on the street in Beverly Hills, just down the street between Chasen's and the Four Seasons, A cop tried to catch him and he managed to wrestle away, and he ran up the red carpet of the Miramax Oscar party and into the party. And the cops had to go into the party to search for this fugitive from justice. Meanwhile, everybody that got into trouble later is at this party. Harvey Weinstein, Hugh Grant, Kevin Spacey. It goes on and on and on. It is maybe the most sinister Oscar night of all time.
Oh my gosh. Except maybe Sean Combs wasn't there, right?
No, I don't believe he was there. Not that night.
But he took lessons from those Harvey Weinstein parties, I'm sure.
Yep.
Scott, it has been such a pleasure having you. I want to thank you so much for taking time out to talk with me about your amazing book, Beverly Hills Noir. The audiobook is out now, paper book is out, and I want to raise a toast to you and your continued success with it.
Cheers.
Cheers to you.